Good evening, and thank you for attending this evening. My name is Matt McCarty. I will be your moderator this evening. And this evening, the question is the wild horse population in Nevada excessive? And if so, is this causing significant damage? Nevada State Senator Ira Hansen will present in the affirmative viewpoint, and Mr. Scott Beckstead will present an opposing viewpoint. The format will be as follows. Each gentleman will have 20 minutes for opening remarks as well as a presentation. This will be followed by each gentleman having 10 minutes as a rebuttal to their fellow debaters' presentation opening. Followed by that will be 10 minutes of cross-examination, in which each gentleman will have the opportunity to ask the opponent a question, taking no more than 1 minute to ask the question, with the response being no more than 1 minute as well. Finally, there will be 10 minutes for closing remarks from each gentleman. Senator Hansen will lead in each of those stages. Senator Hansen, you have the first opening remarks and presentation. Your time starts now.
All right, let's start with a statement that was in the newspaper in Nevada in 1995. There are few sights more beautiful than watching a band of wild horses running at full gallop, tails up and manes flapping across the valleys and rolling foothills of Nevada. It's an inspiring sight and not one soon forgotten. The freedom, grace, and unfettered behavior they display seem to capture the image Westerners like. Wild horses to many personify the free spirit of the West. Watching a stallion, nostrils flaring, prancing around his band, sniffing the air, seemingly challenge anything or anyone who dares to take his mares from him to a fight to the death is animal chivalry at its best. Wild horses are image makers. They're romantic. That was actually written in 1995 by a columnist named Ira Hansen. And I still stand by that view. I'm a horse lover. One thing that's really been disturbing in this debate is the horse advocates tend to split us into two categories. There are horse lovers, them, and there are horse haters, which are basically people that believe that we need some serious management. The horse issue in my own family, I grew up with horses. My dad loved horses. The picture on the screen is actually my daughter, Larissa, on our horse, Lakota. And then, that's my daughter, Mallory, on our horse, Bo. And this is a picture of my daughter and her cousin Leah at the, how do you correctly say it? The Gymkhana, where they were young rodeo people. So anyway, I don't want to be painted into a corner that somehow, because I believe we need some serious management of the feral horses on the Nevada ranges, that I hate horses. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, the question that we're debating tonight is, are feral horses overpopulated in Nevada? And I was challenged, saying that the BLM numbers that I've been using are totally wrong. And so Mr. Beckstead and I agreed, this is the debate we're talking about tonight. And he made it very clear in his spicy challenge to me. We'll have some good spice hopefully tonight too. We're not going to put you to sleep, I can guarantee it. Anyway, so that was our challenge. And so first slide is actually, this is the current feral horse populations according to the Bureau of Land Management in the West. Okay, Nevada is about 60% of that. Our graph is almost identical. The number of feral horses in Nevada right now are right at about 50,000. The correct appropriate management levels, which we'll talk about in a minute, are actually the red line. They are not to exceed that red line by federal law. Now, as you can tell, the last time was 2007 that they even met the appropriate management levels. Now, real quick, the laws that govern the BLM and the wild horse situation in Nevada, the first one that everybody is probably familiar with is 1971 Feral Horse and Burro Act from Velma Johnson. It was actually pushed by Congressman Walter Bering of Nevada. And that law required that the BLM manage the horse herds in the areas where they were in 1971, and that they were to manage them in such a way that they have a thriving, natural, ecological balance. That law was again modified slightly in 1976 with the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and that allowed the federal government to use helicopters and motorized vehicles. It was again modified in 1978 with the Public Range Lands Improvement Act, which then for the first time demanded that BLM have what they called appropriate management levels. That's important. We'll talk about that a lot. AML. What does that mean? In Nevada, what it means is the low AML In other words, the lowest population that we're supposed to shoot for is 7,000 horses. The high AML, which is the red line, is 14,000 horses. Now, in the 1978 law, it was very specific. It said that the Secretary of Interior, when there is a horse overpopulation in the herd management areas, in any area, shall immediately remove those horses and get the populations back to the appropriate management level. Now, if you look at that graph, you can see they have not done that. Now, next. These are herd management areas in Nevada, all the blue ones. There's approximately 30 million acres that are part of herd management areas. Sometimes it's a little confusing. There are herd areas, and then there are herd management areas. Herd areas are about double that size. But what happened was a lot of those areas simply did not have the forage and the water resources to allow a feral horse population to exist over time. So the BLM, by law, set up these herd management areas. And in each of those herd management areas, they set up specific objectives as to what the population is supposed to be. So Mr. Beckstead, though, has said, and I must say I have a little bit of an advantage. I don't know Mr. Beckstead from Adam. The first time I've even heard of him was when he challenged me to debate, but he has debated this issue extensively. And consequently, I went back and found statements on what his positions are on the horses. And he makes it very clear. The Bureau of Land Management has for decades spun a false narrative about an overpopulation of equines that the agency claims are in danger of starving and destroying their habitat. And we need to understand when the Bureau of Land Management does its surveys, how do they do it? They first do an aerial survey, then they do an aerial infrared survey, then they do a ground count, then they have several methods of cross-checking to make sure that they actually have a very accurate count of the horses. Now, Mr. Beckstead was correct in one regard. Well, actually, before I get to that, here's a picture of a Nevada range. We'll be having a series of pictures, by the way. Quite interesting. The horse in the middle, you see that FC? That stands for fertility control. That horse has been captured previously and given PZP. And as you can tell by looking at both the ground that they're pounding across and the ribs that are sticking through, we have, this is a Nevada horse, Nevada picture of Nevada rangeland. We have a serious ecological problem when the horses start to look like that. But we'll get more into the weeds on that in a second. Here is another example of a situation. This is a riparian zone. If you don't know what a riparian zone is, essentially it's a water area, spring, a pond, a perennial intermittent stream. And they're not supposed to look like that. Of course, a dead horse in the water, you will look at the rangeland around it. Also, all the pictures that I'm going to show you in the next few minutes, in every single case, there's been no livestock on these allotments, on these herd management areas for at least 15 to 20 years. Some have been as many as 40 years, as you'll see. So all the ecological damage you're looking at in that picture was caused by horses. And this is not some cherry-picked picture that I came up with. This is actual rangeland pictures. And the pictures that I'm going to show you too, I have not cherry-picked the worst possible pictures. There are literally thousands of pictures provided by the Bureau of Land Management and the Nevada Department of Wildlife, verifying these terrible circumstances that we're witnessing right there in that picture. Here's another one. Here's a little foal dying at a drying up water hole, but notice the condition of the land around the horse. It looks like the moon. Does that look like a thriving, natural, ecological habitat to you? No, it is absolutely disgraceful that we have allowed the horse populations to reach the point where they've actually dried up the water holes, and now the horses are actually dying on the range. Now, Mr. Beckstead challenges the BLM numbers. He has the first slide I showed. The BLM actually requested from the National Academy of Sciences, very prestigious organization, to do a review of their entire program. This report was issued in 2013, and Mr. Beckstead was correct in this regard. The BLM numbers were incorrect. In fact, the BLM had grossly underrepresented the number of horses on the rangelands by a factor of 10 to 30%. And that is right here what they're saying. Now, we also have to understand, we are talking about population growth. And Mr. Beckstead and his position is that we have no need to get involved in it because the horses will naturally regulate their populations. When this was reviewed, this concept was reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences, here is actually what they said. compelling evidence exists that there are more horses on public rangelands than reported at the national level. In other words, the BLM numbers were too low, and that horse population growth rates are high. 20% a year is the average. Unmanaged populations will probably double in about 4 years. Now, we can all sit here and as the horse advocates are going to do, pretend that that is not the reality. This is the science. This isn't Ira Hansen taking a wild guess at it. How can Mr. Beckstead deny the reality of what the National Academy of Sciences have pointed out? Well, he has a different method of determining what the rangeland population should be. Here is how you census wild horse populations according to Mr. Beckstead. BLM would have us dismiss what photographers, tourists, and advocates document every day: thriving, robust families of horses living peacefully on vast stretches of federal lands. Now, I have read all of his debates, and not in a single time has he actually produced evidence or some sort of survey or anything. He simply says we should rely on photographers, tourists, and advocates to determine what the actual population of horses are in Nevada. Now, that is absolutely wrong, and that is why we're here today, because this is actually what people believe across the United States. Right here in Nevada, too, Mr. Beckstead, in his invitation to me to have this debate, mentioned that he had done a survey. He had actually driven across central Nevada. And in his drive across central Nevada, he saw thousands of skinny cows and only 12 fat, healthy horses. Now, for those of you that you should be absolutely stunned that that is seriously taken as some sort of census technique. And when you see how the BLM actually does it, and the Department of Wildlife, and the Nevada Department of Agriculture, and the numbers that they come up with, and then have them totally dismissed because of wildlife photographers and tourists and driving across the state of Nevada, in central Nevada, and then determining you from that experience. Now you can criticize the Bureau of Land Management, the range managers, the scientists that have done this, the wildlife biologists who are saying we got this huge problem. See, we don't have a problem. We don't have a problem because we know from these people that the horses are living peacefully on vast stretches of federal lands. Now, why do we have to remove horses? And by the way, I think it's very important to understand tonight's debate really isn't about horses or livestock or wildlife. It's about the health of Nevada rangelands, our plant communities. Because when you have good, healthy plant communities, especially of the native plants that are here, the perennial grasses especially, all three of those will benefit. Once you lose control of your rangelands, once you have a complete degradation, like those pictures I showed you earlier, which were absolutely look like the moon, then all animals are harmed. Nothing benefits when you have situations like that. Whoop, I'm sorry. Essentially, you have when you don't manage the horses properly, they will, every 4 years, double in population. That in turn harms native wildlife species, and ultimately it harms the range itself, so that even the horse populations with time begin to look like that. We'll talk a little bit more about natural controls too when we get to that point. Right here. Now, this is a very interesting picture. This is from the Bureau of Land Management. You notice in the upper picture, we've already exceeded, by the way, in that horse management area, when there were only 608 wild horses, that was still above AML at that time. Now you jump down and look. Now, that's a 6-year window. In 6 years, every 4 years, remember, the horse population doubles. Look what we have in 2018. Estimated population, it went from 608 horses to 1,755 wild horses. Now look at the range conditions in the picture. The upper picture is already, by the way, bad. But in the lower picture, again, this is what horses will do. There hasn't been a cow or sheep on that allotment in at least 15 to 20 years. So don't say, well, it's livestock that's done it, because horses, as we'll see the claim, they supposedly don't destroy riparian zones. All right, and here's Mr. Beckstead again. Here's his claim. Cattle congregate and trample sensitive riparian areas. Horses, on the other hand, travel up to 20 miles away. They don't travel. They don't harm riparian zones. Well, let's look at some more pictures. Gee, guess what? Not a cow for almost 30 years on this riparian zone. That is a spring, and that is a horrible, terrible picture of what happens when you have excessive numbers of not livestock, but feral horses on that population or on that spot. Here's another one. Here they are, wild horses in the spring. You'll notice the condition of the rangeland around it. There's literally no grasses left. It's down to sagebrush and a few weeds. Here's another one. Wild horses, no cows in sight at a water hole. And notice that the condition of the rangelands, the trails going through it, everything else. This is an example of a horribly abused public rangeland. And believe me, if we had that exact same picture and we had, instead of horses, we had livestock, Mr. Beckstead, as the attorney that he is, would be suing the Bureau of Land Management for mismanagement of the public domain. Another one. Here we go. Look at the condition of the range around those horses drinking in that water hole. Now, apparently, we're supposed to believe that that damage was done by livestock. But again, no livestock have been anywhere near this. This is what happens when you have too many horses in a given area. They ultimately eat up all the feed, and that's why those ribs are sticking through, and why the area around that spring looks like the moon. Another example, herd of horses at a spring. Look at the condition of the riparian zone. You wouldn't know that that's supposed to have a nice, healthy riparian habitat around it. Nope. That's what you get when you have excessive horses pounding consistently year-round the habitat around a spring. Another example. Look at it. It looks like the moon here again. Look at the condition of the ground around that spring. That is from way too many horses destroying the Nevada rangelands. This is an interesting one. The horses, in their desperation, there's no grass or anything around this spring. They've actually dug a hole with their paws to get down to the last remnants of water in that spring. Now, by the way, if you're one of those believers in natural control, what you're seeing in the next couple of slides too, you're going to see what happens, because what they do, they run out of water. Well, what happens when animals run out of water? They dehydrate and die. That is how natural controls are. When that spring dies up, those horses under natural control conditions will die. Yet we have people that freak out when we see a natural situation like that and demand that the BLM go out and do what? Fill water troughs to keep the horses from dying in the natural conditions that they claim they actually believe in. All right, here we go again. Mr. Beckstead in the previous debate. Commercial livestock, not wild horses, are responsible for overgrazing. The areas that I'm showing you haven't had a cow on it for at least 20 to 30 years in most cases. Here's an example right here. Deer Springs, located in the Antelope Valley herd management area, no livestock has grazed the area around the spring since the early 1980s. The picture on the left was taken in 1984 when cows were still there. The picture on the right was taken in 2021, same exact spring, same location, and one has no cows and the other has enough horses to totally annihilate the entire riparian zone around that spring. Here is a rangeland picture. This is interesting. This was once a white sage flat. You know anything about range plants, white sage, winter fat, exceptionally valuable feed. What's happened in this situation is the horse numbers have been so extreme, they have literally eaten the plants to death. There are no longer any white sage in that flat. It is now all halogeton, which is, of course, a poisonous plant, but that's what happens when we leave too many horses on the range for extended periods of time. Another one, look at that. Now, this is not cherry picked. This is the areas when you have herd management areas where you have 4 and 5 times the appropriate management levels. And let's see, another example, the same, but again, was that done by livestock? No. Now, this is an interesting picture. This is actually the BLM releasing back onto the range horses in the Reveille herd management area. That particular one is very unique in that it is actually at AML. It is. So here they are releasing horses back. Now, the reason I got that picture, look at the next one. Look at the condition of the range. That is a relatively good, healthy Nevada rangeland with a mixture of all sorts of plants and perennial grasses and forbs. And there they go. The BLM's letting those horses back out on that range. Now, compare that picture, the range, look at the plant community itself, to this one. This is also a herd management area, and this was also once a white sage flat. Now, look at that healthy range when they're properly managed and herds are in correct relationship to how many that should actually be out there compared to when they're 4 and 5 and more times over. I mean, it's very difficult to look at these pictures and then have somebody tell me, well, it's all because of commercial livestock. Nothing to do with commercial livestock. Another example, Here they are. Last one. I'm almost done. My wife's warning me that I'm out of time. Got a minute left. All right. Another one. Notice there's no cattle. That's all horse manure. And it looks like the moon. Again, same one. Last one. This is an important one. There's two bands of horses here, and they're actually fighting. Now, again, you look, the horse in the middle has got his nose down. They're actually fighting over the last remnants of a spring. They have drank all the water. And that right there is what's going to happen if natural controls take place. Those horses will dehydrate and die, which apparently to some people is better than having a controlled roundup by the Bureau of Land Management. Okay, now last real quick, wildlife. This will go quick. Mr. Beckstead said he's never heard of wildlife actually being harassed by horses. Watch for yourself. Those are all examples of where wildlife, and by the way, I'm old fashioned, I have piles of paper, not on the computer. I have study after study after study showing that wild horses on the range are basically, in fact, that they describe them as bullies on the range. They actually drive other animals away from water holes. Oh, there's my warning. Okay, well, I'm out of time. Thank you very much. Mr. Beckstead, you're up.
Your 20 minutes begins now.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Senator. Several weeks ago, I posted a video challenging Senator Hansen to a debate over his claims that wild horses were overpopulated and causing an ecological catastrophe on Nevada's public lands. Now, I singled the senator out, but there are several voices that are doubling down on a mass public disinformation campaign by the Bureau of Land Management to justify inhumane helicopter roundups of wild horses and burros off of their rangeland homes to make way for more commercial livestock that are already dominating our public rangelands. And I hope today to give you the other side of the story. As Matt said, my name is Scott Beckstead, Director of Campaigns for Animal Wellness Action. I'm also a part-time law professor at Willamette University. That beauty making me look good in that photo is a Wyoming mare, Mustang mare named Mystique. And we are in downtown Washington, D.C. for the premiere of Wild Beauty Mustang Spirit of the West, Ashley Avis's new documentary that exposes what's happening to our wild horses. Let's start with language because words matter. Enemies of the wild horse love to use the word feral to describe wild horses. It is a dog whistle. Feral is a dog whistle used to diminish public support for our wild horses and burros living on our public lands. But for the record, I mean, when you look at it, feral has a negative connotation and wild has a positive connotation. But for the record, federal law defines free roaming horses on our public lands as wild. And if you've ever been out there on the range and watched these animals behave, they have been living out there for generations and they are most definitely wild animals. Wild horses are also accused of being invasive, non-native, not indigenous, but that ignores the natural history of the horse. Horses originated and evolved here on the North American continent beginning over 50 million years ago. And the fossil record places Equus caballus, which is the same species as that horse in that photograph there, in North America about 5,700 years ago, which is after they were beginning to be domesticated in Asia. The fact is that horses originated here, they evolved here, and they have inhabited North America for all but 0.009% of their natural history. As Ross McPhee, the curator of the American Museum of Natural History, said, the family Equidae evolved on this continent. It is as American as anything you could possibly imagine. And my friend Eric Mulvar, wildlife biologist, said wild horses were co-evolving with the native vegetation and wildlife for over 50 million years. They evolved to the current species right here in North America. And yes, wild horses were here in Nevada. You even have a fossil of a prehistoric wild horse species known as Equus pacificus in your Nevada State Museum. But we should also consider what the indigenous people of America say. Some tribes maintain that we have always had the horse, and I especially recommend the writings of Dr. Yvette Running Horse Collin, who has done a deep dive into the archaeology and the paleontology and has gone into the work to establish that wild horses have always been here. Horses are a native indigenous species. Sheep originated and evolved in the Middle East. Cattle originated and evolved in Southeast Asia and Central Europe. Sheep and cattle are not indigenous. They are invasive. Horses evolved here. They originated here. They are native. That is why horses thrive out on these harsh, arid, mountainous landscapes, but cattle, not so much. All right, so let's dive into AML, because this is really at the heart of the senator's case, that because Nevada horses are over AML, and they are over what the BLM has said is AML, that means that they are overpopulated and causing an ecological catastrophe. And as he mentioned, in 2013, the National Academy of Sciences, this is a team of scientists, researchers, and academics, took a top to bottom review of the BLM's wild horse and burro program and made a number of findings and recommendations. Regarding AML, the National Academy of Sciences, or NAS, said that they could not find a single science-based rationale for the BLM's AML. They also said that there was no transparency in how the BLM arrived at AML. And that is because AML is a politically contrived number. It is a number snatched out of the air by the BLM to drive the agenda to keep horses at a number that livestock producers can live with without them being a threat to commercial livestock. Now, the NAS also found that that AML should be adaptable, that it should be changed, that it should evolve to fit the conditions on the ground. They also found serious problems with the BLM's population estimates. They were based on poor statistical analysis and poor statistical modeling. And those of us who watch the wild horse population know that's true. In 2021, the BLM said that there were 82,000 wild horses in the American West. That year, they rounded up 20,000 wild horses and took them off the range. And in 2022, they said there are 82,000 wild horses living on the range in the American West. We know that's not true, and I dispute that they go out and do actual body counts. They don't. They sit at their computers and do statistical modeling, and that's what the NAS had a problem with. My point here is that over AML does not mean overpopulated. Over AML simply means a number that does not fit the agenda of enabling industrial scale livestock grazing on our public lands. And here we are a decade later, a decade after the National Academy of Sciences issued its findings and recommendations, and the BLM still has yet to implement any of them. All right, so these next few slides are going to be a little bit graph and chart intensive, but follow along and bear with me here. The map on the left shows all of the lands owned by the BLM in red, and as you can see, the state of Nevada is almost entirely red. It has the most BLM managed lands after the state of Alaska. So the vast majority of the state of Nevada is public lands owned by the American taxpayers and managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And so it follows that because Nevada has the largest amount of BLM lands, it also has the largest population of wild horses by quite a measure. Now, I do not necessarily, in fact, I do not agree that there are 50,000 wild horses and burros here in Nevada. I dispute that that's an accurate number, but for the sake of this debate, that's the number that I will go with. So let's talk about animal unit months. The AUM is the unit of measurement that the BLM uses to allocate forage to different species. One Nevada Mustang weighs an average of 800 pounds and gets 1 AUM. Cattle these days are much larger than they used to be when AUMs were first come up with. So one cow-calf pair, which is a cow averaging about 11 or 1,200 pounds, and her calf, which is 500 to 700 pounds when it's taken off of her, is one AUM. This is another way that the BLM allocates more forage to livestock than wild horses. Let's talk Nevada-specific data. Livestock are allocated 43 million acres of public lands for forage. Wild horses and burros are given 15.6 million acres, just 1/3 of what's given to livestock. Livestock are allocated 1.8 million AUMs for Nevada on public lands, and wild horses and burros, 153,732 AUMs. Now that graph over there is not Nevada specific, but as you can see, it gives the general point that the BLM is allocating the overwhelming majority of forage to commercial livestock on our public lands. That little blue sliver is what the BLM allocates to horses. And notice that even the BLM calls them feral horses. But let's talk about all Nevada ungulates combined, all Nevada hoofed animals combined. Cattle, 430,000 head of cattle in Nevada, 58,000 head of sheep, 120,000 native ungulates. Those are the big game species that the senator prizes so much. And horses and burros, 50,000. What this all translates to is that all of the non-horse ungulates are outnumbering horses 12-1. I like this picture because I like the coyote crossing in front of the two Mustangs. So public employees for environmental responsibility did a deep dive on the BLM's own data. Okay, so this is the BLM's own data that I'm referring to. And what Peer found is that the BLM's failures continue to neglect and ignore overgrazing by livestock. If you look at the graph on the left, that shows the amount of land that is failing the BLM's own rangeland health standards overwhelmingly caused by livestock. The second, which is much, much smaller, is the combination of cattle and horses, or livestock and horses combined. But look how tiny. Let me see if I can get this little, yeah, look how tiny. And again, this is not Nevada specific, but the number of rangelands failing the BLM standards attributable to horses is minuscule. In Nevada, 83% of assessed lands are failing the BLM's own rangeland health standards. On 72% of those failing Nevada lands, wild horses are not implicated. That means that wild horses are only implicated on just a fraction of the overall failing lands. But cattle and sheep are considered by the BLM as the contributing cause for 76% of Nevada public lands that are failing land health standards. The BLM's own data reveals the negative impact by wild horses is negligible. According to the BLM, wild horses and burros are responsible for a failing allotment less than 1% of the time compared to the livestock. That is a national figure. I would expect the number would be a little bit higher here in Nevada because you have more horses here. Now take a look at this map. This is a map that Peer prepared. And for context, that body of water there, that's the Great Salt Lake. So basically everything to the left of that is the state of Nevada. And it's all of the sections and blobs are grazing allotments by the BLM. Every red grazing allotment is failing the BLM's own rangeland health standards. And in the allotments that are failing, it is the livestock, not the wild horses or burros, that are overwhelmingly cited by the BLM as the cause. And all of the allotments that are in light gray, those are allotments that the BLM hasn't even bothered to assess yet. The BLM isn't even doing its job in determining whether all of those areas are meeting rangeland standards or not. Of the total acres assessed, the BLM reports that 50% fail to meet land health standards. This is a total of 54 million acres across across the Western United States. And in Nevada, there is a 1.4 million acre allotment that has yet to be assessed. So this, I feel like this picture is valuable and also a little bit of a metaphor. What the data shows, what the Bureau of Land Management's own data shows, is that livestock are the baseline cause of failing grazing allotments. And in almost all of the failing allotments where horses are present, the damage is additive to overgrazing by livestock. So will that Mustang have an impact on the range? Yes, he will. Of course he will. He's a horse. But any impact he's going to have is going to just be supplemental to the damage created by all of those sheep that are surrounding him. Okay, so these are pictures that I actually took on Monday. I went out to several areas to look at wild horses in the range. The picture on the top left is out by Fernley. And the pond there down at the right is the pond used by the Fish Springs horses outside of Minden. Now, no trampling, no manure, no damage to the banks of the ponds at all, and no manure around there. Plenty of manure out there in the brush, but no manure around the pond. Contrast that with this. This was, we drove out, we were somewhere out in the Stagecoach area, but this is an area where there are both cattle and horses. And what we saw on the left is a spring that was completely destroyed by cattle and covered in manure and urine and utterly destroyed. And the spring on the right, same thing, surrounded by cow patties, cow manure in the spring. This is a spring that's supposed to be used by both wild horses and cattle. And it was an absolute mess. And we saw no horse manure around either of these springs. We saw horse manure on the way up to them. But, you know, horses and cattle treat their water sources very differently. Cattle are far more likely to congregate around the water sources and never leave. That's why they're more likely to urinate and defecate in the water. Horses are more likely to come in once or twice a day, drink, and go back out onto the range. These are photographs. The top left is a photograph taken not too far from that damaged spring that I showed. And as far as you could see, cow patties and bare dirt, as far as you could see. The two pictures down below were sent to me by Craig Downer, who's a wonderful wild horse advocate. And he was out in the area between Lovelock and Imlay, and he said he was out looking for wild horses. He saw just a few scattered, but he saw lots and lots of cows, and he said all of this rangeland is utterly destroyed by an overpopulation of cattle. These photographs were sent to me by a rancher in the Ely area who ranches on her own private property. She says every year these sheep come through by the thousands, and when they leave nothing but dirt in their wake. They utterly destroy the range, and there is nothing left for anything or anyone after they're gone. You want to talk about an ecological catastrophe? Let's look at what livestock grazing on public lands is doing. A study by Boone Kaufman et al. Established that livestock grazing is a major contributor to climate change. Their top line findings: cattle grazing exacerbates the effects of climate change. Livestock grazing degrades riparian zones and wetlands. Livestock grazing decreases sequestration and storage of carbon. Cessation of livestock grazing increases carbon storage, and livestock grazing will exacerbate the effects of fire in a changing climate. But who gets blamed? And who pays the price? Recently, there was a roundup here in this area of the Antelope Complex where the BLM rounded up over 3,000 wild horses from this vast, wide open area. 39 horses at least were killed, including this stallion, who, when he tried jumping out of the trap, snapped his back legs, and the BLM chased him with a chopper and a guy on horseback for 35 minutes before he was finally put down. but the BLM will allow nearly 20,000 head of cattle to go back out onto that range. The American taxpayers are footing the bill for animal cruelty in the form of subsidized grazing at $1.35 per animal unit month, while producers in other parts of the country are paying a market rate of like 24 per animal unit month. The helicopter contractors are making tens of millions of dollars. The short-term holding costs for taking these horses to government corrals, it's astronomical, and hundreds of millions to these long-term holding facilities with ranches in the Midwest that should be feeding cattle. And who are spreading the disinformation on behalf of the public lands grazers? The Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, the Nevada counties who declared a wild horse emergency, and state politicians like Senator Ira Hansen. So that's my opening remarks, and you're up next, Senator.
We will now go to 10 minutes for a rebuttal of the opening remarks. And your time starts now.
Thank you. Well, let's start with the idea that feral horses are not feral horses. Because you changed the definition of wild in the Wild Horse and Burro Act, wild means native to the area. So Mr. Beckstead and his ilk have to try to come up with some way to make animals that are actually domesticated animals that are turned out on the range. That's what a feral animal is. So instead, they now try to claim that, no, the indigenous populations of the United States have been saying that they never left after the Pleistocene. Well, at the time of the Pleistocene, we were in an ice age. We had ancient Lake Lahontan here. We had the dire wolf. We had saber-toothed cats. We had short-faced bears. We had the American cheetah, the American lion, which all ate the horses. So the horses that actually lived on Nevada were about the size of a Shetland pony, and they died out at the time of the Pleistocene. Okay, so the idea that the horses that are here are somehow descendants of animals that have been on this continent forever is just absolute nonsense. They've done several studies, genetic and DNA studies. The average horse on the Nevada ranges, if you were to take a sample of their blood and compare it to the horses right on the closest ranch to it, they're almost a perfect match. So that idea that these animals have been here for 10,000 years, and even if they did in fact evolve here, the range is totally different. Let's talk the range real quick, because this is critical. Most of you have experienced seeing a professional arborist prune a tree. Now, first time I saw that, I was shocked how the tree looked. It was just destroyed in my mind. A year later, though, when I came back, the tree was incredibly healthy. Now, what would have happened to that same tree, though, if the arborist would have repeatedly, constantly, every time there was something green on it, went and trimmed it off? It would have died. Now, the perennial grasses of Nevada, which is what we're talking about when it comes to the health of the Nevada range, are just like a tree. They grow from the roots. And when you properly prune them, when you actually have the livestock in Nevada go out, or the horses for that matter, go in and remove at the correct time. Remember, the key is timing, intensity, and duration. If you can control those three factors, you actually can prune the plants of Nevada and make them more healthy. It is critical, though, that you understand there's a certain time to do it. There is a length of time that is allowed. And then how many animals do you actually put on it? And through trial and experience from our range managers, they've come up with a way that we manage livestock in Nevada very effectively. And by the way, some of those pictures, if in fact that kind of situation is occurring, I would have written Mr. Beckstead, then the BLM should go out there and take care of it. But by trying to blame livestock for all the range degradation in Nevada, and there is a problem with him not using Nevada-only slides. Nevada, most of the other states, honestly, have almost no feral horse populations compared to Nevada. I mean, it's night and day difference. So when you start combining those all to make the case that well, Nevada, it's not really a problem, that's ridiculous. Nevada has a huge overpopulation problem. And you'll notice too in Mr. Beckstead's presentation, he doesn't actually give any numbers. He never actually says, well, maybe it's 50,000. Well, if the BLM numbers are wrong and they are not overgrazing and they're not way beyond AML, what's the proof? Where did he provide proof in that presentation he just did? He didn't. Now, livestock grazing. He also accuses the Bureau of Land Management of being in bed with livestock interests. This is almost laughable. Since 1971, the number of AUMs that are allocated in Nevada to the livestock industry has declined by 1/3. In 1971, there were 670,000 cows on the Nevada range. Currently, there is 450 or less. The amount of time that those animals are allowed to graze has been dramatically in decline. The other fact is that on paper, there are AUMs. Now, remember, officially, there's a 30% decline as of now. But reality is that a lot of ranchers, because they will lose their allotment if they don't renew it every year, not only renew their allotment, but then they claim full use of the allotment, even though the horses have totally devastated the range plants and there's literally no feed available for them. I would guess, and it's a hard figure to nail, but I would guess the AUMs from 1971 to current in Nevada is down at least 50%. 50%. So this idea that the BLM is in the back pocket of the livestock industry is ridiculous. In fact, when you look at the numbers, if BLM is a friend of livestock, well, those are the kind of friends, the old saying, friends like that, who needs enemies? Because they literally have devastated a lot of the land. Cattle, it's really funny too. Sherm Swanson, a professor at UNR, did an extensive survey of how horses and cattle interact with riparian areas. And basically, cows do 1/3 as much damage as a horse. He picked them up at 51%, horses at 31% or something like that. The point is, when he shows a picture that, well, yeah, the cows are in there defecating, urinating in the pond, supposedly, but horses don't do anything like that. Remember the pictures I showed you originally? The horses were doing that damage exclusively. The idea too, this is an important one. In Nevada, we actually have the Nevada Test and Training Range. It is a 2 million acre area that is managed by the BLM. It has the Nevada Wild Horse Range set up in 1962. And there isn't a cow or livestock for over 50 years in this area. So how does the BLM manage this in conjunction with the federal government that manages it? They set the BLM in an area with no livestock, set the high AML at 500, the low at 300. And guess what? It is probably, and the scientists have all said, it is a model for how you can correctly manage the public ranges with the horses. Yet, according to Mr. Beckstead, that can't be, because the BLM in this case has no boogeyman of livestock to be catering to. No, in fact, it is a model population of how the horses can exist on the range. Remember, the big giant difference between livestock and horses is timing. Horses are on the range year round. They are pounding the perennial grasses that exist to death year round. And like I said with the pruning example, when the horses consistently are on the same plant year round, just like pruning that tree, if you prune it constantly, it will die. And that's exactly what has happened on Nevada rangelands, our perennial grass communities, on all these horse management areas where they're dramatically over appropriate management levels. Mr. Beckstead can tell you whatever it's doing in New Mexico or whatever, but in Nevada, the photos, the evidence is overwhelming. And by the way, it is Mr. Beckstead and his group that have constantly sued the BLM and forced them into court and made it almost impossible in some cases to do very reasonable gathers, as is required by the Wild Horse and Burro Act. As I stated in the very beginning, the Secretary of the Interior is required by law that when he has a high AML, he is to remove the excess horses now. But because of these constant lawsuits, you can see where those numbers have gone clear through the roof. And as far as the idea of cows being non-native, just so you know, during the Pleistocene, there were actually 2 bovine species that went extinct. So if we're going to use the romanticized image, we can very clearly say that the cattle that exist on Nevada ranges today are descendants of the Texas Longhorns that came with the conquistadors. And there were millions of them in Texas along with the Mustang. And then people like John Sparks of Texas drove all those Texas Longhorns into Nevada. What a romantic image that is. And actually, most Nevada cattle probably do have a little bit of Texas Longhorn in them still. My point is this romanticizing and trying to make native out of something that's clearly not native, and to pretend that the conditions on the range right now in Nevada are somehow the same as the very end of the Pleistocene. It's just, it's embarrassing. It really is. It's not science. It's a bunch of made up nonsense that unfortunately is being perpetrated by people like Mr. Beckstead all across the United States. Remember, for the people in this audience who actually are in Nevada, you're very much aware of the conditions on the range because you can see it yourself, especially those that live out there. But keep in mind that Mr. Beckstead's target audience are people in Wisconsin and Georgia and New Hampshire, and they give tons of money when they see slides like this, in which they claim that, there's no problem with wild horses in Nevada. The problem is those greedy ranchers who are dominating the Bureau of Land Management and forcing them to remove horses. No, it is so the opposite of what the reality is on the range. And if, in fact, we're going to sit here and we're going to say, let's remove livestock, how in the world can you sit there and say, hey, guess what? Let's leave horses on year round to pound the perennial grasses. And the problem that we have now at 50,000, remember, every 4 years they double. In 4 years, you're going to have 100,000. And is the problem going to go away at that point? No. The problem will only exacerbate with time. If we don't get a handle on it now, it's highly unlikely that we ever will. And what's really sad is the range itself is harmed, badly harmed, and is almost irreparable for decades to get those perennial grass communities, forb communities, and the shrub communities back that actually belong here, that actually are native. And in the absence of those, not only are the horses harmed, but the wildlife. We haven't talked at all. Mr. Beckstead divides the whole world up into horses and livestock. Well, there's a whole nother component that we have hardly even touched on, and that is the wildlife communities. And no, not just the bighorn sheep or the romantic ones. I'm talking the 40 plus sagebrush obligate species that are being driven into darn near extinction in those areas where the horses have destroyed the native habitats in those riparian areas and in the range as a whole.
Thank you very much, Senator Hansen.
I'm sorry, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Mr. Beckstead, you have 10 minutes of rebuttal and your time starts now.
Thank you. First of all, to be clear, the photographs in my slide presentation are all Nevada horses. And regarding the horrific photos that the senator showed of skinny horses, that's the BLM's failure. And, you know, the BLM gets every single dollar that it asks for from Congress. So there should be no reason why horses are in that condition. And if they are in that condition, that's BLM's failure. I mean, for heaven's sakes, go out there, put in some guzzlers and fence off the riparian areas. And if you have to do supplemental feeding, do the supplemental feeding, dart every mare that comes in to water. If you have to remove horses because they're overpopulated, after accounting for an overpopulation of livestock, sort out the bachelor stallions. They're the most adoptable ones anyway, and turn the horses back out onto the range. But that's BLM's failure. Now, you know, he talks a lot about how you know, the horses are causing all the harm and livestock are not. But notice the words of the former BLM official in Nevada, Lloyd Eisenhower. He talked about how the horses and the livestock are very, very different. He talks about how cattle tend to congregate in riparian areas and do far more damage to riparian areas than horses, because horses come in, water, and then go back out onto the range. He also said that it makes no sense to continually point the finger at wild horses, given that the vast majority of harm done to the range is by commercial livestock, just because of the sheer numbers. Now, in terms of managing livestock grazing, you know, for many, that means just putting your horses out, or your cattle or sheep, and especially cattle, out onto the range and leaving them there for several months, and then finding out who you can pick up when your permit is over for the year. There's no management there. And besides, you're talking about cattle that are bigger and doing more damage than these Mustangs are. And in terms of me targeting people in Wisconsin or Georgia, I'm a Western guy. I've got a whole group of supporters from Nevada right here. I work with Nevada people. I went out on the range with horse advocates from Minden and Carson Valley and Reno. There are a lot of people here in Nevada who see things the way not that Senator Hansen does, but who want to see thriving, healthy wild horses living wild and free on our public lands. Okay, so let's talk about the wildlife issue, but let's be perfectly clear. For all the things that he said about the sagebrush obligate species, the only species that Ira Hansen has ever expressed any sort of concern for are the big game species: deer, elk, pronghorn, bighorn. But the studies have been done. Researchers have gone out to see how these species all interact, and what they have found is that horses peacefully coexist with other wild species. Now, I have no doubt there was you had some pictures, Senator, of elk running away when the horses show up. I'm sure that happens. I'm sure when a stallion comes in, he pins his ears back and the deer or the pronghorn or whatever get out of the way. But that's not the same as horses aggressively chasing down other wildlife species. And in fact, one study specifically found that there was no evidence of interference of competition between feral horses, cattle, and pronghorn. And I also want to point out that according to the Nevada Department of Wildlife, other than mule deer, Nevada's big game species are thriving. Mule deer have been struggling here in Nevada, but guess what? Mule deer are struggling across the American West. And scientists say that it is because of loss of habitat, loss of forage, and climate change. They never blame the wild horse, except for here in Nevada. There's 68,000 mule deer, says the Nevada Department of Wildlife, mule deer here in Nevada. All the other species are doing fine. There's been a 2-year decline in bighorn, but there's no data suggesting that that is due to wild horses. These statements, especially by the Nevada Department of Wildlife, I went through their big game reports and all of their information, and they say without any verification or substantiation or proof whatsoever that wild horses, or feral horses as they call them, are impacting big game species. Let's talk about sage grouse. This is a critically vulnerable species that is under consideration by the federal government for listing on the Endangered Species Act. And once again, we see here in Nevada that wild horses are being blamed, and yet the Nevada Department of Wildlife says that it's livestock that does the damage. And it's also the academics who say that it's livestock causing the harm to sagebrush habitat. Now, one of the things that's happening here in Nevada is the federal government is doing a mass poisoning of ravens. According to the senator, 10,000 poisonous eggs have been strewn about the landscape in Nevada to kill ravens, to protect or boost sage grouse populations. That's treating a symptom. That's not treating the underlying cause. The reason why ravens, who, as you know, corvids, are smarter than most of us in this room, they have learned to watch for areas that are being grazed on by cattle because they know it will be easier to spot the sage grouse eggs. Okay, and while we're talking about it, sage grouse are imperiled here in Nevada, and yet the Nevada Department of Wildlife is still allowing sport hunting. Last year, 1,617 sage grouse killed by sports hunters. Say what you want about the wild horses, I'm pretty sure they're not out there hunting down and killing 1,617 sage grouse. Let's talk about horses, wild burros, and native carnivores. Senator Hansen wants to have it both ways. He's out there complaining about we've got too many ravens, we've got too many lions, we've got too many coyotes. But what the studies show, what the actual research shows, is that horses are preyed upon. They are a prey species, and they are preyed upon by native carnivores, especially lions. They prey heavily on wild burros. And another study by Lundgren and et al. Said that increasing protections for mountain lions would likely reduce wild horse and burro population growth rates and reduce their impacts on ecologically sensitive areas. Senator Hansen does this strange circular reasoning thing where he says that wild horses are to blame for an overpopulation of mountain lions because, and that causes increased predation on mule deer. What nonsense. It's the exact opposite. These researchers say that as long as you've got horses out on the landscape, that takes pressure off of the other wild ungulate species. As long as these lions are taking horses, they're not taking mule deer. And so what they're saying is, if you want to boost mule deer populations, which we all want to see, then let the lions stop artificially suppressing lion populations and coyote populations to benefit the livestock industry. Let's restore some natural balanced ecosystem. These species evolved together. This is how they keep each other in balance. Okay, wild horses and mule deer. It makes no sense to blame wild horses for impacts on mule deer. They eat entirely different food sources. Deer are browsers, horses are grazers. Nevada still allows mule deer hunts and makes no mention of livestock impacting mule deer, even though livestock are outweighing horses 10 to 1, but they continue to allow sport hunting of mule deer. In 2022, they set a quota of almost 16,000 mule deer for a population of 68,000. Again, I don't see wild horses out there actually killing mule deer. Why are we not protecting the mule deer? Why are we not doing everything we can to make sure that the mule deer have every chance they've got? And as far as bighorn, again, some slight declines. But what the Nevada Department of Wildlife says is that the biggest obstacle to growth in bighorn sheep populations is domestic sheep, because they transmit disease to bighorn sheep. They make no mention of livestock or of horses impacting bighorn sheep populations. These are two species that do not compete. These are two species whose ranges often overlap, but there's no data suggesting that bighorn sheep are being negatively impacted by wild horses. Again, these are not species. All the other species are of no concern to Senator Hansen. He only cares about the big game species.
Thank you, Mr. Beckstead.
Yeah, thank you.
At this point, we're going to have a little back and forth. It'll go a little bit quicker than what it's already done so far. We'll have up to a minute for Senator Hansen to ask Mr. Beckstead a question. Mr. Beckstead will then have up to a minute to be able to respond to that. That will continue until a total of 10 minutes has elapsed, at which point Mr. Beckstead will then become the questioner and we will be able to move forward from there. Because of the quick times, and to not pose much of a distraction, the only lights that will be used will be the yellow light when you have 15 seconds remaining and the red light when the minute has elapsed. Your first minute begins now, Mr. Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Mr. Beckstead, you constantly belittle the men and women of the Bureau of Land Management, calling them, quote, liars, self-styled cowboys, spinning a false narrative. They do not care. BLM has nothing but utter contempt for horses and the people who love them, quote, cruel and arrogant, quote, terrorizing these vulnerable animals. I could go on and on. Yet the men and women of the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and the entire scientific community are in agreement on the need to manage horses. Do you feel that you owe an apology for your incredibly vicious slanders of the good men and women of these agencies?
Thanks for the question. I certainly don't view it as vicious slander. I'm simply looking at what's happening out on the rangelands. 39 horses killed in the antelope complex roundup. 39. Horses dead from broken legs and broken necks. Foals left alone out in the desert because they couldn't keep up. Foals left alone to perish and die alone. The constant narrative that is put out by the BLM is that these roundups are necessary to prevent undue degradation. And that is absolutely false. It has nothing to do with undue degradation by wild horses. You know, when the BLM sends out a press release announcing a new wild horse roundup, not once do they mention how many livestock are living on the HMA that's being targeted, not once.
Next question. Okay. You mentioned that you're very concerned about the 30 horses or 31 horses that were killed in the recent roundup out of 1,971 horses that the BLM gathered. They actually had 4 that were killed in the roundup process. When I went to the American Wild Horse Campaign website about the Virginia range herd, which they control, they said there were, out of 3,500 horses, there were 1,683 confirmed deceased horses in a 3-year window. Yet you, now this is actually a wild horse advocacy group whose efforts, by the way, I support. You haven't said a word about the 1,600 horses that died under their control, but if it's the BLM, you're all over it. Why the difference?
Well, when you talk about the Virginia range and the BLM lands, this is apples and oranges. As you noted, the Virginia range horses live on a combination of state lands and private property and are managed by the American Wild Horse Campaign with fertility control. They talk about natural mortality, including depredation by healthy populations of cougars, or we call them cougars in Oregon. I know you call them lions here, but you know, that to a certain extent, that is natural mortality happening the way it's supposed to work in the ecosystem when it's balanced. I spoke with a very knowledgeable advocate who took us around the Virginia range, and she said there are some years where up to 90% or more of the foals are taken by lions and coyotes. And, you know, I mean, that's nature at work. But what we see as supporters of wild horses, what we see happening in these roundups looks a lot like deliberate animal cruelty. It's almost like in your face. Chasing a horse with a broken leg for 35 minutes before you put him out of his misery. I mean, leaving foals out in the desert to perish on their own. How do you defend that? That's the question. Yeah,
Thank you, Mr.
I do
Beckstead.
get emotional. The question is, why don't you?
Actually, I do, but that's I'm not allowed to answer respond to the question. You mentioned driving around the West, you'll pass thousands of skinny cows while families of vigorous, healthy horses thrive on public rangelands. Do you seriously consider this a valid method of conducting range health research?
No, I don't. I'm just giving my experience traveling. You know, I have made a number of road trips, Jackie and I, through Nevada, through the heart of wild horse country. And every time, including today or yesterday, when I drove from Reno to here, I saw a lot of livestock and I didn't see a single horse. So no, it's not scientifically valid. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that what I have observed in my encounters in Nevada, where you would expect, where horses are accused of swarming all over the landscape, that I would see more wild horses, and I just don't see it.
Now, you've belittled the BLM, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, all the various range agencies that have been clearly demonstrating that we have overpopulation of wild horses in Nevada. But you haven't mentioned once what research, where are your numbers coming from? Where do you have the right to challenge all of these agencies and claim their numbers are wrong? What are the correct numbers according to you?
I'm not challenging their research because they haven't done any. They don't have any data. I mean, you know, that's the thing. Read the Nevada Department of Wildlife's big game reports. In this unit, we saw impacts by feral horses. In this unit, we saw impacts by wild horses. No data, no quantification, no verification, and no mention of livestock, which I'm pretty sure are going to be outnumbering those horses on those units. Again, this is just this narrative that has trickled down from the Bureau of Land Management and is being seized upon by livestock grazing advocates and allies to push an agenda to remove wild horses to benefit commercial livestock.
Next question. This is your statement. Horses with their simple digestive systems spread native grasses far and wide. Yet their year-round grazing has been exceptionally well demonstrated of the perennial grasses, as has been undisputably proven, kills the plants. Do you dispute that fact? And do you actually believe that they are spreading perennial grasses when they are grazing these plants to death year-round?
You're generalizing. You're making a blanket statement that could apply to this HMA, but not that HMA. Horses are shown to combat wildfires by eating invasive cheatgrass. And yes, they are out on the range year round, but they graze very differently than livestock. And yes, they are ecosystem engineers because they do have the ability, due to a simple digestive system, to spread beneficial bunch grasses that are native all across the landscape. Why are we not encouraging that? Why are we instead allowing overgrazing by livestock, which is shown to cause the spread of invasive cheatgrass? Invasive cheatgrass happens because it's overgrazed by livestock. That's what the data shows.
That'd be fun to debate, but we'll have to do it right. We'll have to question.
We should take this on the road, Senator.
Yeah, we can have some fun.
All sorts of things.
Next question for you. This is a statement from you. Burros serve as ecosystem engineers digging wells that provide water for other species. Where did that come from?
That's an actual study that was done. I wish I had it here with me, but the finding was, and I think this was in Death Valley, that burros have the ability to detect underwater water sources and springs and dig them, and that turns into a water source that is used by all sorts of wildlife species. I'd be happy to send you that study after the debate.
Good. I'd love to read it. Let's see. Real quick. You claim repeatedly the BLM manages for livestock interests, yet we discussed that the National Training and Testing Range, which is 2 million acres, has 0 livestock, yet BLM manages this herd exactly the same way. If livestock is completely absent, what is the BLM's motive to do the exact same form of management?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Can you rephrase it?
We have a 2 million acre area in Nevada where we have the Nevada Wild Range Horse Area. There is not a cow, and hasn't been a cow or sheep for at least 50 years. The BLM are in charge of managing it, and they set the appropriate management levels high and low, and then they go in every 4 years or so and do a complete removal back to AML. If there are no livestock there, and you claim that the only motive for the BLM is somehow to do whatever the bidding is of the Bureau or of the livestock industry, what is their motive to do the exact same process on this particular wild horse range? Which is sanctuary, by the way.
I think I understand your question, and I believe that the BLM follows the same operational model no matter what. I think that they set AML, and if the horses are over AML, they do a roundup. And often it's a pretext to allow more livestock grazing. But in this situation, maybe it's because native carnivores have been artificially suppressed and there's no way of managing the horse population.
Mr. Hansen, or sorry, Senator Hansen, this will be your last question.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned unfounded claims about horses being overpopulated, in danger of starvation, and rangeland being devastated by horses. You claim that's unfounded. Are you claiming the HMAs do not experience ecological destruction when horse numbers dramatically exceed appropriate management level, high appropriate management levels?
I think it is disingenuous to pick and choose specific isolated instances where horses are causing negative impacts without looking at the landscape-wide impacts of cattle and sheep that outnumber wild horses and burros by 10 to 1.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Beckstead, we'll now allow you to start your questioning with 1 minute to ask the question, and Senator Hansen, 1 minute to respond.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. So I want to talk about these county resolutions that were passed that declared an emergency due to an overpopulation of wild horses. Now, most of these districts are in your, or most of these counties are in your district, correct?
Correct.
And what was your role in drafting the language for those resolutions?
Actually, I had pretty much no direct impact on the actual verbiage in those. What I did was, after a couple of counties had done it, I sent that as a sample to other counties to consider, and they modified it to their own liking.
And to be clear, these are resolutions calling on Congress to engage in population control and reduce the populations to AML, correct?
Yeah, that is absolutely what we're trying to do, is get Congress to properly fund the BLM to allow them to get these herd management areas back to high appropriate management level numbers.
And I notice as well that the timing of these resolutions happened at about the same time that you were leading the opposition to Senate Bill 90, a bill brought by a group of school kids to designate Nevada's wild horse as the state horse. So is it not true that you got these emergency declarations as a way of opposing Senate Bill 90?
Actually, Senate Bill 90, I would have to agree that all the people who have a fourth grade mentality would have supported Senate Bill 90, okay? Because anybody that studies that issue, you got to be about fourth grade level to not comprehend what we're talking about. Actually, I started that well before. Like I mentioned, it was 2 years ago, probably 2.5 years ago, whenever Director Raby first came in, that I became aware of the situation. So this was evolving long before the SB 90 bill.
And each of these resolutions make reference to many wild horses dying by starvation and thirst. Did these counties go out and actually collect data to back up what they were saying, or is this just what they passed based on what you were telling them?
Well, actually, I didn't tell them anything, but just for the record, it's kind of interesting. The horses, the 1,683 horses that died in the Virginia range, either starved to death or died of dehydration. There was no management whatsoever. This happens all the time in these herd management areas, but because it's convenient, you don't see it like the horrible broken leg situation, which you've exploited. When you have horses dying of dehydration and starvation by the thousands, as have happened all across the ranges of Nevada over time, which is a natural control, that's exactly what the people on the range have seen. Whether or not they actually had specific data to back it up, you can just do a common sense thing. When you looked at the population of the horses in those pictures that I was showing you, when they run out of water, they dehydrate and die. And that is what we're trying to prevent. The actual people that love the horses, that care about the horses, are the ones that are trying to manage the horses to prevent so-called natural ways of regulating those populations, which ultimately leads to starvation, dehydration, and destruction of the public range resources.
Okay, let's talk about your position on sage grouse. In October of 2014, you issued a report on sage grouse and livestock, where you actually took the position that livestock grazing helps sage grouse. And to illustrate your point, you talk about this Sheldon Refuge, where they brought in 30,000 head of cattle and had 2,700 head of wild horses, and you say that in that reality, the sage grouse were thriving, where before there weren't any.
I'm glad you brought up sage grouse. This is an issue that I near and dear to my heart, because the reality is the highest populations of sage grouse in Nevada was in the exact same window of time, ironically, that grazing was at its highest levels in the state. Sage grouse and livestock go together like bread and butter. The study that I described in that same report from 1986 was done by a UNR student as part of her master's thing. And she said right in it, wow, we were shocked to discover that sage grouse numbers are substantially higher where you had cattle grazing the meadows. And if you look in Nevada history, the highest sage grouse populations go in perfect tandem with when the Nevada rangelands, when the livestock industry was aggressively grazing, but most importantly, they were building meadows. They were creating meadows all over the entire state of Nevada. Meadow habitat is the #1 critical key to have sage grouse. We have 50 million acres of sagebrush in the state of Nevada, but we have a tiny limited number of meadows. Those meadows have to be grazed. The plant communities that respond to that grazing are exactly what sage grouse love. That's why there's a complete correlation between livestock numbers and grazing and sage grouse population explosions. The best spot in Nevada. Okay.
Go ahead and finish.
Okay, the spot, we had the governor's sage grouse team. And when I talked to Sean Espinosa, who was the leader of it, and this thing went on for like 10 years, the #1 spot in Nevada that he said was I asked him, what is your best case example? He said Smith Creek Ranch. Smith Creek Ranch was a cattle ranch that had set up a 1,000-acre meadow complex, and the sage grouse populations exploded. I was there myself. I counted over 300 birds on the meadow. This is a cattle grazed area, including all of the areas around it. Sage grouse and livestock production, the way we do it in Nevada, go together in perfect tandem. If you want to increase the number of sage grouse in the West, you would go back to allowing more livestock in a very regulated way to once again graze those meadows and for the livestock industry to create those meadow complexes once again.
But you're not telling the whole story, are you?
If I've missed something, I'll just
yeah, you've missed something, all right.
What did I miss?
What you're not talking about is the fact that these areas were poisoned by compound 1080 to kill every naturally occurring predator on the landscape. That's why sage grouse populations exploded, because there were no more predators to have any sort of balance. That's the part that you're not saying. You
well,
have hold on.
I didn't question.
Hold on.
Questioning.
You have spoken in a very approving way of compound 1080, a poison that is so toxic that it stays in the ecosystem forever and poisons everything down the food chain that consumes it and is considered a potential terrorist threat. That's the piece you're missing, isn't it, Senator?
Well, actually, you're supposed to ask a question, but I'll be happy to address that. No, I think when we had predator control efforts in the state of Nevada, you saw an explosion in wildlife in the state, not just the big game animals that you're talking about. As far as 1080, the actual population of sage grouse exploded. 1080 came on the scene in 1946, 47. The sage grouse populations actually at their peak about at the time of World War I, 1918. So while I do believe that predator control efforts did help increase the amount, the bigger issues were water development by the livestock industry, the creation of meadow complexes, which are critical for sage grouse habitat, and of course, predator control helps. But the main thing was the changes in the environment itself, especially the meadow complexes, which are critical for sage grouse needs. That's well documented, has nothing to do with 1080. But yes, I do think if you look at the actual numbers of wildlife, that predator control is a substantially positive effect for all wildlife species in the state of Nevada.
Does that mean you support the federal government spreading 10,000 poisoned eggs across the landscape to kill ravens?
The raven population issue came up. Now, raven populations right now are 300 to 1,000% higher than they were historically. That was documented by Dr. Peter Coates, University of Idaho, who did several extensive studies all across Nevada. It is his study that said, hey, we have a serious conservation problem because the sage grouse are actually getting devastated by raven populations, which are artificially high because of man-created food sources, including dead horses. We have actually expanded the amount of these animals that are predatory to the nests and the young birds. So I absolutely am saying that. I am saying I'm glad. I wish they'd spread more. The raven populations are artificially way above what they should be because of man-created food sources, including dead horses on the range.
Mr. Beckstead, we have 1 minute left for your section.
So, when we talk about sage grouse and we talk about ravens, what you're forgetting, aren't you? This is my question. The fact that these meadow complexes and all this work you're talking about is happening on private property, carefully managed by property owners, not on BLM managed land where livestock are vastly outnumbered the carrying capacity of the range.
Well, actually, you are correct in that a lot, even now, the highest populations of sage grouse are clearly related to ranchers and related habitats. Ranchers over the years have created meadow complexes that are hay meadows. The Department of Wildlife actually did an extensive study back in 1989. Guess what? The greatest type of habitat in Nevada for biodiversity was meadow complexes with willow communities. And in their own study, they said these types of habitats have dramatically expanded because of the efforts of the livestock industry in the state. So yes, there is a positive correlation. Livestock overall, when it's managed correctly, has been a net positive thing for sage grouse and for almost all wildlife species. I've seen it myself. I am a plumbing contractor. I've never owned any livestock whatsoever, but I have been on the range extensively. And every time we remove, and I can give you several examples, we have actually had areas that were purchased and you took the livestock industry off of those ranges, the net effect was a substantial deterioration of the range and a decline in the native wildlife populations.
Thank you very much, Senator Hansen. Thank you, gentlemen. That went fairly well, I think, and I appreciate the back and forth there. At this time, we'll now finish or go into our closing portion of our debate this evening, and we'll have 10 minutes for closing remarks. And Senator Hansen, your time begins now.
Okay, well, first thing I want to point out is on the screen, you see a very unusual thing. America's wild horses managing for the future. If you can look closely, though, the bottom of it is the Humane Society of the United States, an animal protection organization. They are joined by the American Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and numerous actual animal rights groups who refuse to leave their heads stuck in the sand and pretend that there isn't a wild horse problem. The more cynical people point out that PZP is patented by these guys, so maybe you can be a little cynical about the Humane Society, but all the other animal rights groups that are working in what are frankly public-private partnerships with the government, these organizations have recognized the reality that Mr. Beckstead just refuses to acknowledge, and that is we have a serious overpopulation of feral horses. If you want to call them wild, you want to call them native, whatever you want to call them, there are way too many of them to be sustained on the Nevada rangelands. Mr. Beckstead actually calls these people in his reports, they are betrayers of the very animals they were supposed to be protecting. He calls them basically traitors to the cause. Yet, when you actually read what they say, they simply acknowledge what the National Science Academy made very clear. Horse populations expand 20% a year, every 4 years, doubling in population. They don't pretend that, well, there's going to be some natural regulation and mountain lions are going to kill them. We could really get into the mountain lion issue too. The Department of Wildlife said there are now 3,000 mountain lions, at least in Nevada. They eat the equivalent of 50 deer a year. Yet the deer population decline you blame on something else. There is a clear correlation to the excessive number of lions. And why do we have excessive number of lions? Because normally predators and prey will have a certain amount of balancing effect. Well, it's because we have this surplus population of horses, and he is correct. The mountain lions will on occasion eat the foals, but not enough to reduce the populations. That's the interesting part. Even though they do kill some of them, nothing even close to being able to help regulate the populations. Man has to get involved, and we have to have the federal government do what it needs to do, and that is properly fund the Bureau of Land Management to do what the Federal Wild Horse and Burro Act requires. You'll notice too, Mr. Beckstead criticizes the BLM for not doing their job, but at the same time, he sues them when they try to do their job. You can't have it both ways. Either the BLM has an opportunity to do what they're required to do by law without you guys constantly suing them. The whole idea that we are actually somehow in this state ignoring the realities and it's all livestock, has nothing to do with horses, it's just pure poppycock. And it's almost embarrassing. You're a very intelligent man, an attorney, yet you obviously refuse to acknowledge what every scientific group, every wildlife agency, every biologist in the United States, every range manager has clearly pointed out. Now, we have an interesting situation. We're not alone in the world with problems of feral horses. This is actually from the Guardian newspaper. This is what I have up there. And you can't quite see the top. It says environment. They have now an estimated 5 million horses and burros in Australia. It is totally out of control. Look at that headline from the Guardian newspaper from last month. Environmentalists, Mr. Beckstead types, welcome plans to allow aerial shooting of feral horses. Can you imagine Mr. Beckstead coming here or his team of supporters saying, you know what, we have so many horses on the Nevada rangeland, we're going to approve the government going out with guns and killing them out of helicopters. That's the situation that exists now in Australia. Okay, so we can bury our heads, we can keep letting horses double every couple of years, and then look what happens ultimately when we ignore the realities right in front of our face. Now, here's another one. Failure to manage, this is Australia again, last month, Guardian newspaper, failure to manage feral horses. I guess we should say failure to manage wild horses, causing devastating impact on Australia now, Senate inquiry here. Again, this is what we're facing if we don't deal with the reality right in front of our face. I don't hate horses. I actually love horses. Like I said in the beginning, I'm a horse admirer, but man, we got a problem in Nevada. And if we're going to continue to try to blame the BLM and we're going to blame the Nevada Department of Wildlife, actually go down the list of people that Mr. Beckstead blames. And basically it's everybody in the United States, including the Biden administration, because they all recognize that we have a serious problem. This problem goes way back. I mean, we haven't been able, honestly, to properly manage the horses in Nevada from 1971 on. And you can look at all the numbers through the years. And so for me, as I look at this, number one, I'm tired of hearing the livestock industry in Nevada blamed for stuff that, frankly, they've been doing a remarkably good job. Yes, there are cases, and there still are cases where they're probably overgrazing. But let me tell you this, if a grazing allotment, a rancher with a grazing allotment has one cow over the maximum amount and spends one extra week on his allotment, he will lose his thing. Yet the very people that are supposed to be managing the horses have 5 and more times the same number on the thing. Who goes after them? You know, it's Juvenile's old question. Who guards the guards? You know, when the BLM does exactly what they punish the ranching community for doing, but they do it themselves, how do we solve that problem? Now, as far as the efforts that I've had with the county commissions and so forth, look, I'm dealing with the reality on the ground in Nevada. I can throw up all sorts of slides. This has nothing to do with wild horses. Look, the evidence is overwhelming. It is totally a problem of overgrazing by horses. The allotments and the pictures that I said earlier, those have been livestock free for decades. There may still be allotments on paper, but let me tell you, if you're a rancher and you want to have other than skinny cows and no calves, you can't turn horses out, or cattle or sheep out where there's no feed, where the range plants have literally been devastated. And you know, it makes me sad too. Look, I want to see healthy Nevada rangelands for wildlife, for horses. And by the way, his statements that I only care about, that's nonsense, because he didn't mention sage-grouse. Look, I care about all wildlife species. I really do. I love the state. It's my home. And those things are very near and dear to me. And that's why when he says stuff like that, that's really kind of a low blow, because it's not true. But again, I want to see healthy horses on the range. I'm not trying to get rid of horses, but anybody that looks at those pictures can't help. And by the way, that the reason I used the pictures was because if I just simply said, you know, there's 5 times over allotments, when you actually see what's going on the range and you see what's causing it, it's not livestock, because that's what he would say. Well, all Mr. Hansen's things are livestock. No, they're not. There's no livestock at all in at least one of those for 40 years. It is horse populations. And we need to recognize that. We need to actually, as a group, help the Nevada Bureau of Land Management get the necessary funding so that we can get the horse populations back below AML and then figure out a way to keep them at AML. One thing I didn't touch, I should probably, I don't know what my time is, but real quick, we didn't touch much on the other magic cure-all, which is to actually sterilize the horses, okay? Now, what does it take to sterilize the horses? Well, first thing you have to do, which Mr. Beckstead objects to, you have to gather them. You have to bring them in. You have to round them up, the very thing he hates about the whole BLM thing. You can't take the horses. You have a little bit of an exception in the Virginia range. That's 291 square miles. Nevada's 110,000 square miles. It's apples to oranges big time. Again, if you want to have this sterilization or birth control thing, you have to gather them up. Now, this is a picture right here on the screen of an actual BLM effort to sterilize horses. You'll notice they're in a squeeze chute. The horses are totally traumatized. The one behind the squeeze chute, as you can see, is actually trying to climb out of the panels. Now there's a lady putting the needle together. She has to you give 2 injections to the horses. Then after they give them the injection, they turn them back out on the range. They have an FC brand put on them. And I don't know, that to me isn't really wild anymore. That's what we call branding. And in the livestock industry, this is what you do with your own domestic stock. They're supposed to be wild animals. Then the other problem is the actual drug is effective for the first year to about an 80%. In other words, out of 10 mares you give the shot to, you're going to have 8 of them that won't conceive, but then 2 still will. Then in a year or 2, in some cases, you have to round them all up again and repeat the entire process. And you have to do that for the full life of the mare. I'm sorry, that is not a practical solution at this time. Now, if you got them down to low AML, so that the BLM actually could have numbers of horses that they could do these kind of programs with. Great, fine and dandy, let's do it. But in the meantime, we need to recognize, until we get those horse populations back down to AML at the very minimum, the idea that you're going to round them up and then give them these shots, PZP or whatever it is they're going to be using, it's just not pragmatic or practical at all. So it's very important, I think, that we recognize the real limitations that are there. And I have to say, in this whole thing, Mr. Beckstead, like these cheap shots against the Bureau of Land Management or Department of Wildlife, basically there is this giant conspiracy among every federal agency and every administration, the Bidens to the Trumps to the Obamas to Bush. There's been this giant conspiracy of the Department of Interior against the wild horse and for the livestock industry. Pure nonsense. What those people are doing are following the scientific protocols that they act. I'm sorry, am I way over time?
Thank you,
That were
Senator
laid out
Hansen.
by the National Academy of Sciences. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Beckstead, by the way.
Mr. Beckstead, the final 10 minutes are yours.
Well, again, I want to thank the senator for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think it's absolutely vital, and I think that there's a lot of additional topics related to this that we could be having. I want to start my closing by mentioning 3 pieces of federal legislation aimed at protecting wild horses and burros. The first is the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act by Congresswoman Dina Titus here in Nevada that would ban the use of aircraft to manage wild horse and burro populations and require the Bureau of Land Management to find more humane alternatives. Second, the Veterans for Mustangs Act. Cameron, where are you? Stand up. Ladies and gentlemen, Cameron Ring has been the driving force behind a bill that would have the BLM train and recruit retired service members and military veterans to help in the BLM's fertility control program. I would love to see that bill broadened even more to have veterans involved in all aspects of range management. And actually, Cameron's got some brilliant ideas for getting more veterans. And I've talked to some of these veterans and they are extremely passionate. They want to help the horses. They would find tremendous healing in the horses, in working with the horses. They would love to be out there on the range using the skills that they acquired in combat and in military service in service to our public lands. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. So the third bill is and this is a bill that we at Animal Wellness Action are working on rolling out, the Restore Our American Mustangs or ROAM Act. And this would basically fix all of the top line problems with the BLM's wild horse and burro program. Everything from the adoption incentive program that is landing unprecedented numbers of horses in the slaughter pipeline, getting rid of the helicopter roundups, and taking an approach to wild horse and burro management that is science-based and that accommodates the wishes of the vast majority of American taxpayers who want wild horses living wild and free on our public lands. Now, Senator Hansen's challenge today was to provide actual evidence that wild horses are overpopulated and causing an ecological catastrophe. And he has provided some photographs that show instances of horses that are clearly in distress. Well, that's a BLM failure. The BLM needs to address those problems, and it's not a tough call, and it's not an expensive call. It's a lot less expensive than going out there with a helicopter and incarcerating those horses for the 30+ years of their lives. The BLM's own data, on the other hand, shows that there is ample proof that it is livestock, not wild horses and burros, degrading the range in Nevada. The BLM's false narrative is that roundups are necessary to prevent undue degradation of the rangeland. They don't actually say that wild horses and burros are causing it. They use it as a pretext for these inhumane helicopter roundups that then allow them to turn huge numbers of cattle and sheep. And we've seen this on the Onaki Range in Utah, the Sandwash Basin in Colorado. They make these claims that this HMA can't support these few hundred wild horses. So they round them all up. And then weeks later, there's thousands of cattle and sheep out there on the same range that the BLM said couldn't support a few hundred wild horses. So yeah, I do get a little worked up about the BLM. I am a little bit cynical at this point and very skeptical about the claims that the BLM makes. And it's because they're driving a false narrative. But you know, whenever you hear about an overpopulation, whenever you hear the BLM talk about an overpopulation of money, just remember that it's not about that. It is about the money to be made. It is driven by, not by science, as the senator claims, but by a political and financial agenda. It is about tax subsidized grazing. It is about tens of millions of dollars to helicopter contractors, hundreds of millions of dollars to off-range holding facilities. This is government gaslighting in service of government grift. People are making a lot of money by claiming horses are overpopulated. And the disinformation campaign by the BLM starts at the very top. Last month, I listened to Interior Secretary Deb Haaland on an Instagram program talk about how she was so proud of her transparency and listening to stakeholders. When on this issue, she has been absolutely the opposite. She's been inundated with millions of emails, phone calls, comments from taxpayers across the country that she won't even acknowledge. You can't even get Secretary Haaland to engage with members of Congress, except the one time that she said that she would be continuing the policies of Donald Trump, although she's been way worse than things were under Donald Trump. And Secretary or BLM Director Tracy Stone Manning, that same day I heard Secretary Haaland, Director Tracy Stone Manning was on NPR congratulating herself about, you know, her commitment to addressing climate change and rangeland resilience. What nonsense. Again, more gaslighting. On this topic of public lands grazing, she is driving climate change by allowing more livestock grazing. And don't even get me started on mining. I know mining's big around here, but have you seen the ecological catastrophe caused by mining? All of this happens, these false narratives trickle down to all these other agencies, and yeah, you listed them, and they seize upon this disinformation campaign, and they seize it, and they blast it out, and it becomes actual policy by the federal government, by the state of Nevada, by the counties like Elko County. We need to stop seeing wild horses and burros as some sort of problem or some sort of disaster, and start seeing them as a solution and as an opportunity. Wild horses and burros can fight wildfires by eating invasive grasses. Wild horses and burros can add to the economies of rural communities. When people, we went out with a wild horse tourism business owner a couple days ago. She had a couple fly in from Switzerland. These people are paying for hotel rooms, gasoline, rental cars, restaurants, groceries. They add to the local communities. We should be encouraging that. So in conclusion, this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then we'll figure out what we're going to debate next. Look, we, the American taxpayers who support wild horses and burros on our public lands, want the lies to stop. The BLM and all the others that are pushing these lies about an overpopulation that's causing ecological damage, it's time to stop spreading false information about wild horses and burros. Stop blaming and scapegoating and persecuting wild horses and burros so that you can put more livestock out on the range. And start telling the truth about the real non-native invasive species, the cattle and sheep that outnumber wild horses and burros by 10 to 1, that are the real cause of the ecological catastrophe taking place on Nevada's public lands. Thanks and have a good night.
Thank you, Mr. Beckstead. Please join me in thanking our two debaters this evening. Thank you very much to you, our audience, for keeping it civil And thank you also to our debaters for keeping the time generally intact. I think we went over about 3 minutes total. So overall, I think that was pretty darn good. I also want to thank the staff of the Elko Convention Visitors Authority for putting this on. So thank you. And thank you also to our media partners and videographers for being able to present this to those who were not able to join us in person. A very
A
safe.
quick thank you to Matt McCarty too, who's our MC tonight. So thank him. Moderator.
Safe travels home to those of you who live a little bit closer to home. For those that live a little bit further, if you're staying tonight, we appreciate you helping the local economy, and safe travels home to you when you do head home. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I hope that we will be able to see you again for another debate at some point, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.